For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'm speaking to some of Australia's and the world's best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea?, brought to you by the Australia Institute. Today, I'm talking with Dr Tilman Ruff. Tilman is a physician who co-founded the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and was its founding chair. ICAN is the first Australian-born Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Tilman recently completed 12 years as a co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, also a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. And he's joining me today to discuss Australia's role in trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons, which his colleague, Melissa Park, the executive director of ICAN, has written about in the anthology, What's the Big Idea? Hello, Tilman.
Hello, Paul.
Tilman, I read in preparing for this discussion today that there are more than 12,000 nuclear weapons in various parts of the world. We don't talk about the risks of those nuclear weapons as much as we used to during the Cold War period, but does the world face as big a threat of nuclear war as it did back then?
Well, by most authoritative assessments from groups like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the group founded by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, that includes on its board of sponsors 15 Nobel laureates, they've this year, just last month, moved the hands of the doomsday clock forward to 89 seconds to midnight. That's further forward than it's ever been before. And most of the other independent assessments from people who know about nuclear weapons, who've commanded and controlled them, assess that this is actually the most dangerous time we've ever been in, and those risks are growing. So even though the issue is less in public consciousness and debate, the weapons haven't gone away. The strategies and policies to use them and deploy them with increasing threats to use them that we're hearing really poses very profound risks to us all. And those risks are being compounded by a couple of factors. One is that a climate-stressed world is seeing more conflict, more people on the move, more food and water insecurity, more places becoming marginal or difficult to live in. There are enormous numbers of displaced people, 117 million around the world at last count now, and sailing upwards. The number of armed conflicts is the greatest it's been since the Second World War, and the number of people dying in them is also going up. So a conflict-stressed world is a more dangerous place for nuclear weapons, because every conflict that involves a nuclear armed state involves a risk of escalation. Then there's the emerging area of cyber warfare, which is really now well established by not just 30-odd states, but also many non-state actors have potential. You can access that technology potential with a couple of smart nerds and laptops from anywhere. And nuclear facilities, we know, and their command and control systems are vulnerable to those kinds of attacks. And the third element that's really worrying me is the advent of artificial intelligence and the really early, before we sort of understand the full implications of the technology or have developed painfully and slowly always, the mechanisms to regulate and control it, it's already starting to be deployed in the military. So it's absolutely critical that systems that we don't fully understand, that could do things we don't expect, act somehow autonomously, don't have any role in the command and control, the decision-making around nuclear weapons. But at the moment, those guardrails are really not there.
All of which, I think, puts in context the need for action. And indeed, Australia was once an enthusiastic supporter of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. How would you describe our attitude to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation today?
I think it's deeply conflicted, Paul. I think that's the reality of our current situation. So Australia likes to claim that we're good guys on disarmament, that we're on the right side of history, that we've always worked for the control of particularly indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. And it's true that Australia has, in some respects, albeit patchy, a reasonable track record. We've signed every applicable treaty in the nuclear field for controlling and limiting nuclear weapons. We led on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the treaty that would ban nuclear test explosions in the air, underground, in all environments, for all time, for everybody. That hasn't yet entered into force, but it was Australia that played a major role in that and actually took it from the Conference on Disarmament, where it was negotiated but stuck, into the General Assembly and moved it forward. Australia joined the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, albeit introducing some conditions that would allow continued transit of nuclear weapons and assistance with nuclear weapons use from Australia and other countries in the zone. And we've signed all of the treaties that ban and control other indiscriminate, inhumane weapons. So the other weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical weapons, and also landmines and cluster munitions. We've joined all of those. And I would really note here that there's a strong bipartisan history of these that I think is also rather lost in the current political milieu that we find ourselves. Those treaties have been joined by governments, both Labor and Coalition. For the 4 Prohibition treaties that I mentioned, it's exactly an even split between Labor and the Coalition. So on these big humanitarian issues with unacceptable weapons, there is a proud bipartisan history, which I fear we've now lost. But on the other side of the ledger, if you're serious about limiting a weapon, if a weapon really is heinous and unacceptable and can't possibly be used in a way that complies with the laws of war, the international humanitarian law, the law that regulates, what governments can do in war. Wars have limits and laws too. You can't use weapons that have indiscriminate effects across borders, that disrupt the means of livelihood after the conflict, that can't distinguish between soldiers and civilians, that have effects out of proportion to the military objective, that spread over space and time, and that affect the means of life, food production, energy systems, water, etc. There's no way that you can use nuclear weapons and comply with any of those rules. But if we want to walk the talk, then the first thing we have to do, and the big job for Australia, is to not claim protection from those weapons. Currently in Australian defence white papers and strategies since the early 90s, America's nuclear weapons are written in under governments of all persuasions as the ultimate guarantors of Australia's security, and if you believe the last couple of editions, Australia's prosperity as well. And therefore, that means there are circumstances in which we believe it's okay for these weapons to be used, deliver indiscriminate radioactive incineration on millions of innocent civilians somewhere.
This is the so-called nuclear umbrella under which Australia sits.
That's right. So there are circumstances where it might be okay to use them, and actually we might want the US to use them on our behalf. And more practically, we host facilities and operations that provide assistance for the possible use of US nuclear weapons. So Pine Gap, the military base in Central Australia, Northwest Cape, the submarine communications base in the northwest of WA, and possibly a couple of others, play a role in identifying targets in the command and control of nuclear weapons in a way that Australia has no control over, but that makes us complicit in any possible use of nuclear weapons, and that also, by the way, elevates our priority very substantially as a nuclear target for any nuclear-armed adversary of the United States.
Yes.
So we're really trying to walk both sides of the street here. If we're serious about disarmament, then the first consistent, logical, principled thing we need to do is to renounce, we can't be protected by nuclear weapons. Nobody can. That's not enshrined in any treaty. That could be a government decision that could be made, overnight. Doesn't need renegotiation of anything. And then we would need to extract ourselves from the role that those facilities provide in possible assistance for use of nuclear weapons. And we know this can be done because other regional states, US allies, and I'd mention New Zealand and the Philippines and Thailand, have continued military cooperation with the United States, completely unimpeded by them joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because their military cooperation doesn't involve nuclear weapons. So it's clearly no impediment to a military alliance. It just excludes nuclear weapons. So other countries in our region have already shown that that's perfectly feasible. And We've done that before. We've differentiated from the US on landmines and cluster munitions, for example. We've signed those treaties. They haven't. And
one thing, Tilman, we could do is we could sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. Anthony Albanese, in fact, once spoke in favour of a future Labor government signing that treaty. This was back in 2018 at the Labor National Conference. We haven't signed or ratified this treaty. Anthony Albanese is now Prime Minister. That is now international law, that treaty, ratified, I think, by some 50 nations. Why have we balked at signing and ratifying it?
It's now actually half the world has signed this treaty, 94 signatures. Indonesia and the Solomons were the last two, and 73 of those have completed their ratification. So yes, it's moving. Why haven't we? It's a very important and good question, Paul. I think very commendably, Anthony Albanese moved, seconded by Deputy Prime Minister currently and Defence Minister Richard Marles, unanimously adopted at the ALP National Conference in Adelaide in 2018, a commitment for Labor in government to sign and ratify the banned treaty, and subject to a couple of considerations that were deliberately negotiated not to be conditions, but considerations along that path. But it was a clear, unequivocal commitment. And that comes in the context where, I think to our great shame, I have to say, Paul, previously the previous coalition government had taken a very hostile view of this treaty, had actively sought to undermine its development, and did not participate in the negotiations. This was the first time that Australia had ever boycotted a multilateral disarmament negotiation. So Labor stepping up and taking that role of advocating signature of this first ever historic treaty that prohibits the worst of all weapons was a major achievement. And that has been reaffirmed, that policy, at subsequent Labor conferences in Sydney in 21 and in Brisbane in 2023. So we now have a government that's led by the only party in a nuclear allied state, so the NATO states, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Armenia, Belarus, the states that claim protection from somebody else's nuclear weapons. We're the only one of those states to have a governing party with such a policy. So it really puts us in an extraordinary opportunity to be the first of those states to kind of break ranks on the nuclear front and lead the way towards the wider prohibition of nuclear weapons. So it's really great unfinished business. The government's taken a few baby steps towards the treaty. It's no longer voting against it at the United Nations. It's sent parliamentary observers. Susan Templeman, MP, was the Australian representative at the first two meetings of the states parties to the treaty. That's the states that have joined it. We've said positive things about it. Penny Wong, Foreign Minister, and Anthony Albanese haven't contradicted the policy, haven't said anything opposed to it. They've said how much value the TPNW brings if it can provide strong normative value and accelerate disarmament. So it's a really important question, and essentially the answer why Australia hasn't yet joined this treaty is essentially US pressure and worry about what our great and powerful friend would think. It's as simple as that. 3/4 of the Labor caucus publicly has stated their support for this treaty. So yes, if Labor is returned, then I would very much hope that signature of this treaty would be a priority for the first year of the next term.
Recently, of course, there's been focus on Australia's decision to acquire nuclear-powered, though not nuclear-armed, submarines as part of the AUKUS deal struck by the previous government, a partnership which further entrenches our alliance with the United States. Does that worry you? Does that send a signal to you going down that road of nuclear-powered submarines that perhaps Australia is moving away from, as you say, its once laudable position on non-proliferation and disarmament?
It's a risk. It really is a risk. The submarines themselves, both the previous coalition and the current opposition government and the Labor government now, have been at pains to say that, look, this is nuclear-powered submarines. They're not going to have nuclear weapons on them. But that's a worry. And there will be increased visits of US and UK submarines being effectively stationed here off Fremantle under the plan. Currently not nuclear-armed ones, but if the Trump administration has its way, then that might change on the US side. There is very significant regional concern about the escalation of tensions and that the submarines signify, and they're really not about, in strategic terms, the defence of continental Australia. They're really about working with the US to project long-range power, essentially to operate in Northeast Asia, i.e. largely if the US enters any conflict with China. That's what they're good for. The long range, the stealth, is much more useful there than it is in the defence of Australia. So from our point of view, nuclear-powered submarines are not prohibited by the Ban Treaty. They're compatible. So it's possible for Australia to have its cake and eat it too here. And we would argue that it's actually more important, given AUKUS, that Australia signed the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, because there's no more effective and enduring way to bind not just this but future governments of whatever persuasion to make it abundantly clear to our allies, to the region, to our people, that the submarines are not the thin end of the wedge for nuclear weapons being stationed here, NATO-style based here, or heaven forbids acquired by Australia. There's no better way of putting in those guardrails than to join this treaty. So in our view, AUKUS accentuates the need for Australia to join this treaty to put those firm guardrails against nuclear weapons in.
I'm Paul Barclay, and I'm talking to Tilman Ruff, physician and co-founder of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. ICAN, the first Australian-born Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Tilman's discussing how Australia can help rid the world of nuclear weapons, which is also addressed in What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute. You can purchase it right now. It also features chapters by Richard Dennis, Peter Doherty, Louise Adler, Fiona Stanley, and other leading thinkers. Solutions to our big challenges, they exist. We just need the courage to implement them. So, Tilman, what should Australia be doing as a nation without nuclear weapons, with a history of pushing for disarmament and non-proliferation? What diplomatic and policy efforts should we be making that we aren't at the moment?
Well, I think the most important thing for us to do is actually to sign the TPNW. That would be the single most important and influential signal that we could take, and that would really be noticed around the world. That would be a really proud moment for Australia to step up and be the first nation under the so-called nuclear umbrella to renounce nuclear weapons as the most indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction we no longer want to have a part of. So we want to declare that they have no longer any role in our defence policies and sign the treaty. That would be the first thing. Then we will need to commence the negotiations, particularly with the United States, around what happens at the bases that we run jointly or they control, that currently assist in the possible use of nuclear weapons. That will require detailed negotiation. It would probably take several years to bring us in a position where we could be in compliance with the treaty, to have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, not encouraging, assisting or inducing or doing anything with nuclear weapons and threats to use them, and join the treaty then. That would be by far the most effective way that we could progress international efforts to control these worst weapons. The second thing we should do, a really part of that process, would be making sure that nuclear weapons are not coming into Australia. on submarines, on ships, on aircraft. Currently, the most acute issue there is the plan to effectively base half a dozen US B-52 long-range strategic bombers at RAAF Tyndall in the Northern Territory. There's $1 billion of infrastructure, a new apron, a hangar, a fuel and weapons storage facilities, support personnel, over 100 of them, that are going in. This is not just about visits. These will essentially be stationed there. B-52s have two forms, one that can carry nuclear weapons and one that can't. You can visibly distinguish them because the ones that can carry nuclear weapons have a couple of extra little fins along the fuselage of the plane. So all Australia needs to do is to say, we'll have just the non-nuclear capable ones visiting here, thanks very much. And we know that we can do that because we have the precedent of Malcolm Fraser's government beginning in the late 70s and into the early 80s, being actually the first government in the world that specifically said to the US, which usually has a policy of neither confirming or denying the presence of nuclear weapons on any craft, Fraser required them to say that they were not carrying nuclear weapons and exclude the ones that were.
But they don't need to do that now.
They don't need to do that now. Right now, there is no restriction on nuclear-armed ships or subs or planes coming to Australia. And if that happens, if these B-52s are based at RAAF Tyndall and we don't have that exclusion, then it's quite possible that for the first time, nuclear weapons could actually be launched, nuclear weapons operations could actually be launched from Australia. I think that's not a place we want to be. B-2 planes, another type of long-range strategic US stealth bomber, also visit Australia. They're all nuclear capable, but they're not stationed here. But preferably we would exclude them along with other potentially nuclear capable platforms. So if the Trump administration decides to put nuclear-armed cruise missiles back on US surface ships or attack submarines that will be coming to Perth, then we would want to exclude those as well. So that's those are additional measures that we should take. And of course, there's a raft of other measures that we would then take to engage with the states joining the ban treaty. And part of the obligation of joining the ban treaty is actually to work for other nations to join it, to build the universalisation of this treaty so that it strengthens the political and legal and moral norm that it provides.
Under the now defunct submarine deal with France, we specifically asked the French to build non-nuclear versions of their submarines. That was what we signed up to. We know that we walked away from that deal. Then we decided that we did indeed want nuclear-powered submarines. What risks do these nuclear-powered submarines pose to us in Australia? And indeed, what do our neighbours in the Asia-Pacific region think about us acquiring these submarines?
There's been a lot of concern about the submarines in the region. Some of it, politely muted, but really some of it, very vocal and quite persistent. Certainly what I'm hearing, countries in the Pacific and Indonesia and Malaysia and others in further in the north, they were caught blindsided by this decision. It's ruinously expensive, of course, and has massive opportunity costs for all of the other important things we need to be doing for people on the planet. But it also, I think the main worry in the region is that it really elevates tensions. It's clearly focused on the capacity to wage war against China. That's not helpful for regional tensions. If a war breaks out between the US and China for whatever reason, it makes it virtually certain that Australia will be an active participant in that war in ways that we probably can't control, and it will make us probably the highest priority, I would suggest, for Chinese nuclear weapons. If the Chinese really want to demonstrate that this is getting serious, they're much more likely to attack an Australian submarine base than Los Angeles or Washington if they don't want to escalate. So I think that's a significant regional concern. Yes, if we were going to go down the nuclear submarine route, it would have actually been much better to buy the French ones. Not only would we have them much faster and much cheaper, but one particular downside of US and UK nuclear-powered submarines is that they're powered by highly enriched uranium. So it's directly weapons usable stuff. It's exactly the same material. So it poses a significant proliferation risk, and we do not want more of this stuff in the world. There would be between 6 and 20 nuclear weapons worth of highly enriched uranium on every submarine, in basically a stealth platform that's designed to hide in the deep ocean for many months at a time. Nobody's supposed to know where they are. It makes them very difficult to safeguard, and it really blows a hole in the international safeguards and non-proliferation regime. Already, when we announced this plan to acquire highly enriched uranium-fueled submarines, a number of other nations said, well, we probably want to consider going down the same route: Korea, Japan, Iran. And you don't need bomb fuel, the problem of which is not just a proliferation one, but that proliferation risk continues even with the waste. So when the waste comes out of that submarine 40 years later, it's still highly enriched uranium, it's still weapons usable. It's a lot more radioactive and harder to handle. We don't just have for ourselves now the health and environmental problem of having to keep this stuff absolutely strictly isolated from the environment for 1 million years or so, but we also have to keep it under military levels of security, because if anybody gets their hands on this stuff, then they can build a weapon with it. That's a particularly unfortunate feature of US and UK submarines that we've locked ourselves into. The French and, by the way, Chinese nuclear-powered submarines use low-enriched uranium. So essentially the same level of enrichment that goes in a nuclear power or most research reactors, which is not weapons usable. And that, from a proliferation perspective, would be a much safer way to go. Australia has in the past commendably advocated strongly and been quite active in helping to reduce the amount of highly enriched uranium around in the world. Our first research reactors in Sydney used highly enriched uranium, the new one doesn't. We have reduced our stocks of highly enriched uranium and helped other countries and encouraged them to do the same. And here we are opening the door for massive quantities, weapons usable quantities, in an essentially unsafeguardable form. It's a really regrettable feature of this, I have to say, really bad decision, I think, for the security and health of Australians.
Yeah, I also understand, Tilman, that some Australian superannuation funds are investing in companies that produce nuclear weapons. Is that right?
It's certainly true that probably most Australian super funds invest in nuclear weapons producing companies, and the Australia Institute commendably collaborated with ICAN recently on a report on Australian super funds, which found that the policies around nuclear weapons and other indiscriminate weapons were really often quite opaque and inconsistent, and that in fact companies that didn't necessarily say that they were doing so were investing in such companies. And a report released just last week confirms that Australian banks also have about $7 billion invested in companies that profit from making these worst weapons of mass destruction. So yes, for everybody, I think, check the policies of your bank and your super fund, because there are alternatives. There are, I think, now 7 super funds in Australia and more coming that don't invest in companies that are involved in these horrible weapons, and we should prefer to choose those if our financial institutions won't make those restrictions.
Yes, I mean, important to point out that Australians don't want their superannuation funds invested in nuclear arms development. 69% said that their super fund should not invest in this, according to the Australia Institute. So, yes, an issue I don't think many people know about. You're speaking to me today, Tilman, about an issue that Melissa Park, the Executive Director of ICAN, has written about in What's the Big Idea. She was a former minister in a Labor government, a former member for the seat of Fremantle until 2016. She's been speaking out about nuclear issues for decades now. Where are the voices in Parliament today speaking out for this? The danger posed by nuclear weapons, as you've made clear, has not receded. We're perhaps at a more dangerous time than ever before, yet fewer people in power are speaking out about it. How do we change this?
Look, on this front, on nuclear weapons policy, it's not something that you can, on many other important issues on inclusion and non-discrimination and on climate action, there are things that you can do in your own home, in your own life, in your own family, in your own workplace, in your own organisation. For nuclear weapons, basically governments make those decisions, national governments. So that is where the locus of pressure has to focus. I guess I sort of have a fairly simplistic way of looking at these things. Things happen because of either leadership and courage or pressure. And if you don't have one, you need more of the other. So if you're lacking leadership, it's really important that people make a noise. Politicians are responsive. They listen. They need to be re-elected. And you're right that the profile of this in the Parliament is unfortunately low. It's completely out of proportion to the importance of the issue. Cabinet hasn't discussed joining the ban treaty, even though that's Labor Party national policy, in a whole term of government. That there need to be voices in the Parliament and they need to hear from us, from their constituents, and particularly constituents. You're the most influential on your member. Also initiatives at other levels of government. For every layer of government, whether it's your local council, your state government or the federal government, their first obligation is to protect and look after the welfare of their citizens. Local councils would be deeply affected if nuclear weapons were used. They're responsible for many of the local services that would be catastrophically disrupted. They have a stake in this and a say in this, also. So our cities appeal now has almost 50 cities around Australia that have taken the decision to support the treaty and urge the federal government to join the treaty. So whatever the level of government, the focus, state parliamentarians don't have specific responsibility for foreign affairs, but they have influence and they're members of the same parties as federal parliamentarians. So yes, this is an issue that needs to be elevated through a combination, I think, of leadership and public pressure.
Look, a terribly important issue, Tilman. Thanks very much for talking to us about it today.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Tilman Ruff is a physician, co-founder of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the first Australian-born Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and Tilman recently completed 12 years as a co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, also a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved, and if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.